Okay, and this is welcome to the metadata crosswalks and relationship to metadata elements session. Okay. And the notes and the sign-in document are at this one, and I can put it in the chat also. Actually, Maggie, would you put it in the chat again? You did that before, and I really appreciate it. So we'll have this agenda, so welcome. Then Keith will be talking about the objectives of the meeting. Alex is going to give us an update and the current status of the metadata standards catalog. And then Jane will talk about metadata ontologies and interoperability. Milan will talk about his independent crosswalking effort, and then we will have more time for discussion. So let's go ahead and get underway so that we'll have time for the discussion at the end. And hopefully I can stop sharing my screen and passing it off to you, Keith.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for the session. Good to have 25 participants. We can have some good discussion. So my task at this agenda item point is to talk about, many of you know metadata interest group and the working groups that relate to it, such as the catalog working group. And the metadata interest group has been going ever since plenary 2, and we've been an active team doing all sorts of work. Our major effort has been on the so-called metadata element set, although before that we created some metadata principles which were accepted by RDA. The metadata element set is an attempt to come up with a rich, canonical superset metadata format to encourage fairness, i.e. the usual findability, access, interoperability, and reusability. Now, we made this session to do with crosswalks because this is an important way to understand the different metadata schemas that are in use and how they relate to each other. However, as you will doubtless know, there is a problem. If you wish to convert from every metadata standard to every other metadata standard, that's an n times n minus 1, i.e. almost n squared problem, which is clearly not scalable and intractable. The alternative is to choose a rich superset metadata standard and convert all other standards to that. But for it to work, it has to be rich and a superset. And that's what the metadata element set being proposed by MIG is all about. And over several years, we've had strong community engagement in dealing with the different elements, proposing syntax and semantics for the different elements within the element set. And let me stress at this point, the element set is not an attribute set. Many of the elements have internal structure. So it's actually a complex, fully connected graph, which is what you might expect, since a rich canonical metadata format that is a superset of the others is bound to be pretty complex. So we've been working on that for a long time. And the purpose of this session really is to explore, first of all, what's going on in crosswalking between different metadata standards, to get some feel for the different metadata standards that are out there and what crosswalks already exist between them. And finally, how this relates to the MIG metadata element set. And we have an eminent set of speakers to deal with all those points. So at this point, I hand back to Rebecca as chair. Rebecca.
Thank you, Keith. As soon as I introduce Alex, I will put a link to the metadata elements in the chat window. So Alex, could you give us an update on the metadata standards catalog?
I will do my very best. Right, you've got the slides up now.
Yep.
Okay. If you're not aware of the metadata standards catalog, I can't really blame you for that because we don't exactly have a PR department. But what we do have is a long history. So let me do my best to bring you up to date. The catalog is the third incarnation of a resource that was originally developed for the DCC, the UK Digital Curation Centre. It was originally designed to help research support staff at UK universities advise researchers on appropriate metadata standards to use when documenting their datasets. The DCC catalogue was launched in 2013, just as the Metadata Standard Directory Working Group was starting up in RDA. The working group joined forces with the DCC and first of all expanded the catalogue to make it usable in a worldwide context and then ported it to GitHub so that it could be maintained by the community. Thus, the Metadata Standards Directory was launched on GitHub in 2014. But even so, there were things that we needed the directory to do that couldn't be done on GitHub pages, most notably a machine interface for plugging it into other systems. And we wanted to be able to use it for more detailed analysis of metadata schemes with the eventual aim of using it to generate converters between them in the manner that Keith has just described. That meant that we needed it to be a dynamic web application rather than a static website. And so the Metadata Standards Catalog Working Group was formed. And over the course of 2016 and 2017, we developed the catalog as a dynamic version of the directory. Getting the catalog operational in production turned out to be something of an uphill struggle, but we got there in the end. Last year, with 3 years of hindsight to help me, I rewrote the catalog from scratch, and the new and improved version 2 was launched last year in September. There were, however, a few big jobs left to finish off, but I'm happy to report that the development tasks at least have now been done, and to coincide with this plenary, we've reached version 2.1. So we had a request in the meantime to add fields to record linked data prefixes for applicable metadata schemes. We considered specifying the namespaces as a type of location, but that was a bit of a semantic stretch. So we've added dedicated support for them, and now this is how they look on the website. One of the things that I didn't have time to re-implement last year was the authenticated API for making changes to the catalog, but this functionality is now back and made compatible with the Google JSON style guide. So API users can authenticate by password, or for preference, request a token, which is then valid for 10 minutes at a time. There are REST endpoints for adding, updating, and deleting the 5 main record types. That's metadata, schemes, tools, organizations, crosswalks, and endorsements. There are separate endpoints for editing the relationships between the records. And while you can use the same 3 RESTful methods for this, it's better to use the patch method so that you can guarantee that you don't clobber any changes that might be happening at a similar time to yours. So for this, we support the JSON patch specification, which is IETF RFC 6902 for anyone keeping track of that. As well as editing the main records, you can also add, update, and delete controlled vocabulary terms for things like data types and location types subject to certain constraints. The other thing that was dropped between version 1 and version 2 APIs for the catalog was the ability to search for metadata schemes. So instead of restoring that directly like for like, it's now possible to filter the results of GET requests to any of the collection endpoints for the 5 main record types, relationships between them, and the editable controlled vocabulary terms. The filter parameter supports a subset of the Lucene search syntax, so you can use wildcards and Boolean operators, search for dates lying within a range, and specify which fields that you want to search. that's all the techie stuff that I have planned for version 2, which means we can now get on with the much more important task of ensuring the quality of the information that's held by the catalogue. We're aware that some of the records have not been touched for many years and are missing some information that we only started collecting recently. So I want to go through them all again, make sure everything is up to date before migrating this information back into the earlier incarnations and finally retire and deprecate the intermediate metadata standards directory. If you want to help out with that effort, you're most welcome to do so by going to the catalogue and logging in with your RDA website credentials. You can reach the metadata standards catalogue at the URL on the screen, or by following the links from our working group page or from the metadata interest group page. I'll pop it in the chat as well. But that's the end of my update. So back to you, Rebecca.
Does anybody have any questions for Alex before we go on? We'll have time for a discussion too, but I thought I'd see if there are any questions right now. Okay, moving on to Jane. Oh, wait, there is a question, Alex. Does the catalog have a web front end or just an API?
It has both. Yeah, I mean, the API was just what you saw. So that was some of the screenshots from the latest additions to the API, but you can see the presentation from this time last year for some examples of the unauthored, the read-only parts of the API where you can get the information out in a JSON format.
And all of our previous sessions are on the metadata interest group webpage. There you have one other question. What is the relationship between metadata catalog and fairsharing.org?
They there isn't a formal relationship between them as such. We're both accomplishing similar aims, but they're not entirely identical. As I say, they grew out of different efforts. The fair sharing came out of the kind of bio domains and has since gone domain agnostic. And as I say, what the eventual aim of the metadata standards catalog is to allow analysis of metadata standards and as Keith was describing, the ability to generate converters between arbitrary pairs of standards via the metadata interest group metadata element set.
Right, and Susanna has a, did you want to unmute and say anything?
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Not much, I just added the link of the new beta version. And like Alex said, we have different goals. In fair sharing, we interlink not just we don't just register the standard, we interlink the standard to the repository and the repository to the policy, and we have relation graph for those.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I'll wait for a minute, see if there are any more questions. If not, Jane, I can see your slides, so go ahead. Jane? You're muted. I think you're still muted, at least that's what it looks like.
Yeah, if you're presenting, then the button for unmute is actually above on the screen where you're presenting from, instead of looking for a separate Zoom window.
Ah, thank you.
I am so sorry.
No, no
Get it?
problem.
Okay. You didn't miss much.
Okay, you
All
get to
right.
start again.
We're going to try again. Hi, everyone. I think I know a lot of people on this call, but not everyone. Just by way of introduction, Jane Greenberg, I direct a small center called the Metadata Research Center. And the work that I've been involved in for the last 2 years has started to focus in materials science. I'm part of a new large institute where we're looking at interoperability amongst materials science data, things like catalysis, thermoelectrics. There's even an area called meta materials, which I get many jokes about on the team. And so we have a lot of discussions about interoperability of data and the metadata to support that. And so my intent today was to raise some questions about what are we doing when we start to build these crosswalks? Why are we doing it? And I don't want to sound dismissive of any of this stuff that's been reported, because I have been deep in. I've worked with Alex and Keith and Rebecca on these projects. I've been in many of these meetings over the years about making two standards, two metadata standards interoperable. And I want to say that there's been a lot of good work. I'm not sure I really have a continuum to display. Maybe it's a matrix, maybe it's some other kind of shape. But it's really to get us to think and discuss, because there's been so much good work, but it is important to take a few steps back and remember why we're doing what we're doing. So I wanted to just offer some definitions, a rationale of why we seek interoperability. And then I have 3 questions. And really the goal is to help facilitate the discussion. So to keep moving on, sort of an obligatory definition, and there are many out there. I've been very involved in the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative over the years, and I really like this definition. The blue highlighting is mine, and the italics, I think I probably went a little crazy, but basically, making things connect and talk to each other without prior communication, that we want to exchange information, and in our case, a lot with the RDA, we want to exchange data and make it useful and meaningful. In the Dublin Core community, this is often broken down by semantic interoperability, structural and syntactic. And so, and generally people in this area, we get crazy, we like to classify, but it is important to compartmentalize the components. And so I think, in looking at this, I don't have to necessarily read the different areas, but semantics, we're talking about meaning and definition, structural frameworks, modeling, and syntactic is dealing with the encoding aspects, or I sometimes think of that as some of the packaging. Another diagram by Marcia Zhang, who is a metadata researcher, quite active in the KOS, knowledge organization systems community. She adds another layer called system data presentation. And this added element is really dealing with, on top of the 3 that I listed for Dublin Core, is really, I want to say system protocols, or the actual transportation. So you can have great semantic, syntactical, and structural interoperability, but you've got to have the system protocols to actually make things move amongst systems and so forth. So why are we all not necessarily obsessed, but working on these problems? Why are we looking to bring data together, right? Information, data, the exchange of data and information among users, applications, and systems can help advance research, lead to new discoveries, supporting the fair. We talk about, many more people having a piece of the pie can lead to new discoveries. We've all, sort of seen these predictions about big data, how open data, this is just one article on agriculture, can help solve world hunger. We think about grand challenges. I mean, even the work to come up with vaccines for COVID. This is just an article from Wired about the cure for cancer is in data. And so we are working constantly to find ways to build bigger pools of data, because there are also still data deserts out there. There's data that we don't have that we need, but if we pool data together that we have, we can address society's challenges and so forth. So to the questions, and these are just initial answers of brainstorming, and hopefully they can incite some discussion later on. Are we approaching metadata interoperability goals in the right way? So in thinking about this, as I was putting this together, I'm scratching my head and saying yes and no. Yes, because we're building bridges amongst various communities. I think collaboration is good. No, Keith, you really hit on this, that it's extremely, extremely time consuming, but then I add, well, good work takes time. People say good art takes time. So maybe not. Are we going about it in the right way? I think, we should ask the question, are there some instances where we're just looking for interoperability for the sake of interoperability without a clear goal of a scientific question? Like we make these standards all interoperate and we'll crosswalk them or so forth, but is that the best use of time? And surely we can debate all of these, but I'm just putting this here to raise questions so we can take a step back. The next one is, what is good, bad? And I don't like the word ugly, but I was inspired, this is a classic spaghetti Western film. Some of you have seen it, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. So I just say good, bad, and worse. So good. Many wonderful interoperable repositories leading to data discovery. There's been a lot of good things that have come out of people thinking about these hard questions. So I just listed OAI, EML, DDI, schema.org, so forth. Keith, I put your effort there with what you were presenting earlier. I don't have the right acronym, so I just gave a little smiley face. Bad, we still have so many competing overlapping metadata standards, and there's this dumbing down often to achieve interoperability. I think some of the solutions that Keith was talking about, it can help alleviate that. And then worse, I think about this sometimes, the multiple competing standards, just like even before we talked about metadata so much, like why do we have MLA, APA, Chicago, Harvard, all these different citation styles? Like, is that indicative of the future? There's never really going to be one Uber standard. But are we set up this way? Is there still this prevailing not invented here attitude? So even though solutions are out there, people coming to the table where they need metadata, there's still of this not invented here, I've got to create my own. And then just worse, adopting of a standard doesn't always support the science. So, sometimes, a community is told you've got to work with this standard or so forth, but it's not really what they need. And so there's this, what is it? Square peg in a round hole kind of thing. So again, what is good, bad, and perhaps worse? These are initial brainstorms. I'm sure we could discuss and argue, and I could end up with a completely different table or put things in different categories. But again, just to incite discussion. So question 3, and this is really to prompt the larger discussion. Should we modify our approach to achieving interoperability or metadata interoperability? And if so, how? Some of the questions then, because I don't really have an answer here, is nothing like answering a question with more questions. It's just the same old thing, and I think many people have seen that comic where, it says, oh, we need to create a standard because we have too many competing standards and they all get in the room and there's 13 standards and the result is 14 standards. So here I am answering a question with more questions. But should we modify our approach? What is or might be the approach of AI in supporting our goals to work on metadata interoperability or have an interoperability continuum? I'm not even sure continuum is the right word. Where should we start the interoperability quest? And I think we have experience. We've all been involved in this, but I mean, I think it's important to ask, are we starting in the right place? What questions should we ask first? And should interoperability be system driven or science driven? And are these two goals at odds? And really, where do we start? And again, just thinking I could come up with an answer maybe for some of these, but think that I'll leave that for open discussion. And are there some concrete steps? Are there some guidelines or something that we as a group might collectively think about in working on these projects? Or maybe they already exist and they're just not necessarily shared. I think I can end here, and thank you.
Are there any questions for Jane?
Rainer, I see.
Rebecca, there's various interesting comments in the chat.
Oh,
I have seen that, but let me get so I can see hands. Did you say Reiner had a question?
Reiner, and then I'm trying to get the name of the other person.
Oh, Maggie has her
Yeah,
hand up
Maggie.
too.
Okay, hi, Maggie. Yeah.
Thank
Go
you very
ahead.
much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for raising these questions, and I think it's really, really worth to look into them. For me personally, what you have described as worse is not that bad, because I think having a diversity of standards is fine. With a but, it is only fine if the standards or whatever people or scientists use is well preserved and the description is maintained or is well described, and the description is preserved for the future and it is transparent, then everything is fine. Having a kind of a hidden standard which is not described, I think this is exactly which I also would put into the category worse. But thank you very much for raising this question. Cheers.
Well, thank you. I was a little nervous because I really don't want to be dismissive. I've been down in the trenches, and I still am right now in the material science. Thank you. I like what you're saying. Yeah, I guess Maggie.
Yeah, great summary. I really like your good, bad, and ugly/worse table. Food for thought. I think one reason that there are these new standards and or schemas and or vocabularies, etc., being created is that people, especially out in some community, they find someone tells them you need to use a standard, and they start looking for some, and they find something that fits almost perfectly, but there is one field missing, or something is not quite right, or it doesn't have quite all the terms that are needed in the vocabulary, etc. And then they are at a loss on how to proceed, and then they sort of create a clone of the first one and add the stuff that they want and try to push that as a standard with their colleagues, and then it just keeps proliferating like that, with this sort of the shoe almost fits type of thing. So I think the professionals like yourself need to come out with very strong guidelines and the recipes for what do you do in such a situation. Who should you call? The metadata busters or?
Yeah, no, I'm right. You know, the metadata solution people. And Alex might even jump in here. The whole idea of the metadata application files where you can pull different elements from different standards. I just think it's a brilliant idea. It just didn't kind of become as mainstream as I want to say metadata geeks thought it could be. And maybe that's something to push on more. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Alex, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, just to concur, really. I mean, that is the exact reason why the application profile idea came around. It's why linked data is something that we like to push, because it is a lot easier to roll your own application specific metadata scheme by plugging in lots of standard terms from different places, which makes it interoperable with other systems that recognize those higher level schemes. And it would be nice to see more standards go down that route. But there are other ways of trying to accomplish the same thing, that some of the ones that aren't fully linked data, but XML based, maybe some of them have built into their schemes the ability to insert other metadata documents within them so that you can extend it in various ways. And so if there are stuff, I was doing this with some archival material in my institution recently, and it was nice to be able to take a mods record that could do most of it, and then because we were talking about video files, then stick in some video MD metadata into that and combine that into one standards compliant document that was richer than mods would have allowed on its own. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah. I was just thinking even about the whole like phenomenon with Wikidata now and the Wikidata ontologies. It's just, it is happening. It's just happening in a different way. I see that Keith has his hand up. I'm trying to see who else. And there's a question, I think it was Rob or Phil wrote about the scientific question. So maybe Keith, and then we can look at the chat, I guess. I don't know, Rebecca, you'll tell me if time's up or is time up?
No, you're good.
Okay, so Keith, and then I wanted to look at the chat. It was Phil asked about the scientific question.
Okay, I was just going to concur that the standard way is to advise people to use an existing standard and make an application profile which extends it for your own purpose. I've been involved in a project where we've done exactly that with DCAT, and the problem is the AP is 3 or 4 times bigger than the original DCAT. So the scope for interoperability is very much reduced. There's the core DCAT is interoperable, but the rest of it really isn't. And this is a real problem with application profiles. And what we also have been seeing is that some application profiles actually do have quite a big intersection. So in those cases, interoperability is achievable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Keith. So I'm not sure I'm getting everyone's questions, but I'm just going to go to the chat for a second. And Phil says, the need for a scientific question is interesting to me. Are there other types of questions that justify interoperability? I like this: strategic, organizational, operational. Yes. Yeah, I don't. I think sometimes we emphasize even strategic, like we've got to go with an interoperable standard because of later, like the potential, like we're preparing for the potential, undiscovered public knowledge, that kind of thing that can be found. But that's also where I say sometimes it's, working on interoperability for the sake of interoperability, and maybe there's a point of diminishing returns. I don't have the data to support what I'm saying. It's fun to raise questions, but I think there are some things we really need to think about and could offer clearer guidelines. Phil, did you want to say more?
Yeah, so you're right that that's a form of strategic interoperability, is finding new questions to ask. But what I was thinking about are the sorts of strategic questions that somebody like an institution or a funder would ask. Mm-hmm. And so being able to connect various pieces of information or outputs or researchers or whatever kind of entity you perhaps identify with a piece of metadata or a persistent identifier, and then being able to ask questions across all of those, yes, also requires interoperability. And that's necessary for informing, say, national research policy in order to get the most bang for the buck out of the billions of pounds that governments are spending on research money. And so that's, and also, of course, from an institutional perspective, because they want to be the most effective, and they want to increase their impact on a national or a global scale. So I was wondering, the focus on the scientific use cases for interoperability, I wonder if there's another aspect of this that needs to be considered when we're designing this sort of thing around those kinds of almost business requirements, to use a crude term for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm reviewing right now for a grant program. I don't think I can say what it is for, but it is focused on the area of metadata and achieving interoperability and the scientific questions that these researchers want to ask across domains and why they need these variant data sets to be interoperable, to me, is really a compelling case. You know, they're data sets that have completely different standards. And if they can put them together, they can research questions that they really can't now. But I feel like I'm giving you a meta answer, but, you know, right. I think that this, you know, proof that, you know, or what is it, success cases, proof of concept, or it's, you know, where because it was interoperable, look at what the result was, look at the impact. And, you know, those things are really hard to collect, but having them can be helpful. Yeah, good point. There's more things in the chat. Thanks, Phil. Yes, Rob raises the question about scientific credit for designing a new standard, not for, even worse, you can get scientific credit for defining a new standard, not for using one. That's true. That's interesting. Thanks. Yeah, I think I got most of the questions in the box. Rebecca, should I turn it back to you now for group discussion, or?
We have one more presentation from Milan.
Oh,
and I think he's ready to go. And
good.
Milan,
Thanks all for the discussion, and I'd be happy to continue with any of you, or we'll see what happens in the larger breakout. Okay. I'm muting now.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Okay, Milan, could you also introduce yourself?
Thank you. I will briefly present the crosswalk I developed for the EOSC interoperability framework. I'm also author of this EOSC interoperability, one of co-authors of this EOSC interoperability framework. And maybe a good question is, what is interoperability? In interoperability, I think is we need agreement with parties which want to be interoperable, and they need to obey a standard. And if we have this agreement, for example, I lead development of our Slovenian open access infrastructure. We have meetings, for example, for 2 months, and we agree on some actions what we will do, and it is possible to do. But you know, in every how I say a large organization, you have some sub-organization. For example, at University of Ljubljana, they have a lot of faculties which don't want to obey rules. And it's not simple to be interoperable if you have your own rules. And also what is important, you have legal interoperability rules, then you need to establish processes. If you have processes, then you need to establish also a standard which you need for these processes, and also you need to establish workflows, etc. And then you need to have a technical infrastructure. So all layers of interoperability are important, I think. Not only, but also if we go on metadata standards. In metadata standards, I learned a lot from different metadata standards. every metadata standard has his own purpose. For example, schema.org is good for Google data search, for example. Dublin Core is good for simple metadata without usage of complex vocabularies, etc. I will show this on this presentation maybe, but it has been very interesting. What Jane told in previous section, and in our framework we have made a recommendation for all interoperability layers. We have also proposed a reference architecture and recommendation of EOSC minimum metadata set for repositories and data archives. And I made Crosswalk, and Crosswalk has been input for a recommendation of EOSC minimal metadata application profile, which is served for recommendation of EOSC minimum metadata set. This is first appendix of our EOSC interoperability framework. And what has been motivation for a Crosswalk? From my experiences, I have seen that many metadata schemas, application profiles, and guidelines from metadata aggregators. We have a lot of these schemas, and the problem is that these schemas are on different levels of granularities. For example, in one metadata schema we have description of author with a string. In another we have description not only with a string, with name, surname, ORCID ID, etc. So if we have more granular metadata schemas, it will be much better. Also, from our repositories, I have seen poor metadata quality. Why? Because researchers insert metadata into repositories and they only want to publish an item, not, for example, they don't insert for a license, for example, or so we need good curation of this metadata. Also, in some metadata schema, they don't have enough control vocabularies. They use only strings. And also, what is problem in a lot of cases, we don't have appropriate mappings between different versions of metadata schemas, application profiles, also control vocabularies, and also other semantic artifacts. Also, what is important, PIDs. I think in most of metadata records, we don't have authority control for persons, places, corporate names, projects, research group, etc. So we need PIDs for these artifacts. Also, what is important, we don't have enough information in some metadata schemas which we needed for citation, fundability, reusability, accessibility, and interoperability. And the last motivation is, of course, these recommendations for minimal metadata set for repositories and data archives. And first, I wish to present very briefly what is fair digital object. I think all of us know what is fair digital object, but I will why I will repeat this. We have a digital object. This is, for example, a data set, or this is, for example, scientific article, etc. And this scientific article or data set is represented in files with bit sequences and is stored in repositories. And also, what is important for fair digital object, that this digital object has persistent ID and also has metadata. And for PIDs, you can see we need also checksum for integrity of this digital object, and also we need type, we need transaction chain, we need rights, we need metadata and provenance. So this is important thing. And now how I have started, I use this Crosswalks for the beginning. Some of Crosswalks evolves now. For example, this Crosswalks from schemas to schema.org is now another version. But this has been my my first guidelines. And but we don't, for example, in this first crosswalk, we have one schema.org attribute, and we have alignment of this schema.org attribute, for example, for doubling core, to dcat, to etc. Also, I use Dataverse metadata crosswalk because Dataverse is widely used in this community, data management community. And also I have used EDMI metadata properties use case and mappings from one project from European Union. And in my crosswalk, I used for first use this also RDA metadata interesting group recommendation of metadata element set. But I use also other guidelines and also application profiles, which is important for general metadata, not for domain-specific metadata. I use also some vocabularies. DataCite is very where DataCite 4.3 schema is very useful because I think is very good for description of attributes for datasets. Crossref vocabularies and also crossref schemas are very useful for representation of scientific production, like scientific articles, monographies, etc. And also in Europe we use OpenAir as aggregator, and we need to use also vocabularies used in OpenAir. But also I use in our crosswalk also other vocabularies from Dublin Core, COAR, schema.org, and also from Mark. Maybe I will show very briefly this crosswalk. You have seen one attribute, and first is attribute in RDA from RDA metadata interesting group, and you see from this crosswalk that in some cases we have only simple attribute. For example, in Dublin core, in data side we have more granular element data element metadata, more granular metadata element, and this is for all these schemas and profiles. If you want, you go through this. Also, I also present some vocabularies from data sites. Also, DCAT is very how I say, a lot of public administration repositories used DCAT as a standard for metadata. So we also use DCAT. Also, there is classes from DCAT application profile. This is DCAT 2.0. Now DCAT 3.0 is a little bit is evolved. Then we use crossref metadata groups, crossref types, crossref vocabularies. OpenAir guidelines for crease managers is also important because we wish to build also metadata for other fair digital objects. We have OpenAir vocabularies and other vocabularies. Also, we use some things from bioschemas and from schema.org. I will go on next slide. And from this crosswalk, I have built EOSC minimal metadata application profile. It is not finished yet, but what is important? Important is that we have some information about fair digital objects and some other classes which is important for fair digital objects. This is all for fair digital objects. And then from these fair digital objects, for example, for dataset, we have additional metadata. For service, we have additional metadata. For software, we have additional metadata. For workflow, we use Crossref metadata element set for this publication part for scientific publishing, because we think that its Crossref is metadata element set is the best for this purpose. I didn't finish this. I don't finish this application profile yet, but I have done a lot of things. Now I have finished dataset, service, software, workflow. I will need to finish also this, and also this part for infrastructure. I have some additional sources for doing this. Maybe I will show you very briefly this application profile. You can see this is for every for core metadata of a digital object. Also, maybe what is important is I added influence on FAIR, which the metadata element is important for FAIR. Also, I added examples, and also I added requirement levels, what is mandatory, optional, recommended, and which type of metadata for which type of metadata we need this information, and also from which standard metadata standard or guidelines or application profile I use this element. The same is for agent. The same is for relation identifiers, for location, for project reference, for rights, for terms of access, for files. What is maybe, and also we have different vocabularies.
You have about 2 minutes left.
Yes, I will finish now. So if you want, please, you give me some suggestions. It will be very welcome. I hope that we will work also on this in this new EOSC semantic interoperability task force, and also we will work on this application profile in GEOSC semantic data interoperability working group. But I hope that also in RDA they will support, you will support work on this. I will go on the last slide. Last slide is thank you. And please, if you have some questions, I think that we have a lot of questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions for Milan? Reiner, did you want to say anything about the fair digital object?
Well, just a comment to that what you said, Milan, in the beginning. I'm not the expert in Crosswalks, but what I like about the fair digital object concepts, and this is also something we are doing in RDA and beyond, is that all the information inside is transparently described. For example, that all the data entries must be typed, and this helps a lot for the transparency and for the future usage.
Yes, this is very important.
And this is my definition of interoperability. Yeah, I can use it somehow in the future.
Problem, for example, in schema.org is they have not strong typing of attributes. It's possible to use everything is possible to add in this JSON LD. And I think if we want to be interoperable, we need to use vocabularies. We need to agree also on ontologies, which we will use. It is not only on the, how I say, on the level of metadata. The same is on the level of data set or other fair digital object, because we need to describe this, that computer will know what this means. If we want machine actionabilities, executability, and readability. For us, it's important. It's not important a type. For computer is very important.
You have a question in the chat. Donnie, do you want to unmute and ask it?
Sure, thank you. Nice talk, Milan. My question is, I was interested in your diagram of your minimal metadata application profile, and I'm wondering if you could go into a bit detail, perhaps I missed it, the distinction between the different colors and maybe what that represented in the diagram. And as a related question, I'm interested in your inspiration for boring certain things, like you mentioned DCAT, and I'm familiar personally with the W3C provenance ontology that defines things like agents. So I'm wondering specifically where you got your agent thing and what inspired that choice, and just as a follow-on to what the various colors represent. Thank you.
Colors, for example, this color is for infrastructure. This color is for simple, fair digital objects. This color is for collections. And for example, in metadata, we have in data sets, we have domain-specific metadata, and we have cross-domain metadata. And also, for example, a data set, also software, workflow, and also semantic artifacts have different distributions. In DCAT, we have this distribution class also. And I use this. Also, I also present distribution in this EOSC minimal metadata application profile. But we need, how I say, we need a lot of agreement if we want that this application profile will be useful for all. Also, what we wish to do, I will try to find some funding for finishing this profile, and also to do a tool for transform into intermediate formal, for example, one metadata, from one metadata standard to another with usage of intermediate format. Because I think in some cases it's possible, in some cases we will lose some semantics, because in some cases it's not possible to do this. For example, if we have metadata in simple Dublin core, it is not possible to extend this into, for example, data site metadata format.
Thank you for the elaboration.
Okay. There's a real interesting conversation going on in the chat about definitions of standards and schema. Does anybody want to talk about that?
Maybe about schema and standard. You know, before we have we use XML, for example, from 1998, and in some cases, for example, in Crossref or also in DataSite, they have XML schema. And so I think I use this term schema for some of these metadata formats or standards. Maybe someone else will tell more.
I can jump in, but it's probably another question. No. So when I teach about this, I think there's like a canonical understanding of the difference between standard and schema amongst people who maybe coalesce or get together more on metadata more often. But I do think that there is also a lot of confusion because of the diversity of people in the field. And, so you hear people sometimes say standard when they're referring to what maybe people who are deep in metadata would say is a schema and vice versa. So when I teach about it, I kind of say to students, look, you need to know that if you're at a conference with a lot of metadata people, like who really have been at this for a while, there's like somewhat of a canonical understanding, but it's not always clear. And I don't have a better answer than that. I see Wolmar has his hand up. Maybe he can help elucidate. But I think that it's an important distinction to nail it down. But there are times where it's a blurry line. I don't know. Okay, I'm muting again.
I'm not sure I can clarify that much, but I mean, it is some kind of nail in my foot or something. So people tend to use standard as something that's equivalent to any schema. And I think that is bad practice when talking to colleagues that are not in the field, so to speak. If you're talking to a new research group, there should be some kind of minimum requirements before you go to the level of saying that this is something that we really encourage people to adopt on a wide basis, so to speak. And I think, to me at least, the word standard implies that it's more than just a schema for one application and like a limited time frame of use. So you need to define it a bit more clearly for it to be suitable for widespread adoption. And you might also want to have some clarity in the process of updating or how it was developed, so people can understand, like, why are these fields here and why have we chosen these restrictions on the fields, so to speak. So I mean, in this context, for example, I think it makes sense to use either, but maybe just be clear what we mean by it and not use it like without thinking.
Brian, did you want to add your definitions?
Sure. I was just commenting that I see schema as a specification of, the order of elements, for example, and how you would express in those elements. Any different system could have their schema for that specification. Standard is a more common or universal or large agreement to a specification. So you could have a standard schema. You could have a standard process, right? The standard is not limited to schema. And it gets confusing in discussion, because if referring to a standard schema, people may just call it the standard instead of the standard schema. And then you start to end up using the schema and the standard as interchangeable terms. But, any system with a repeatable pattern has a schema that can describe that repeatable pattern. But if many of us agree collectively to use the same schema, then that starts to become a standard. And then there's actually formal definitions and processes with standards developing organizations for it to be, considered standard with all the many processes in how that occurs. So that's how I would define the difference between schema and standard.
Rob, did you want to add anything? I was looking at your chat item about diseases. Or Phil.
That was, of course, a bit tongue-in-cheek. So this is something that I really see very often in research, and not only related to standards, that researchers often think that their problem is unique, and that will also result in them not looking for standards, not looking for solutions, not looking for existing services, but always developing their own. And then, of course, as I wrote earlier, you actually can get credit for publishing those new services and new incompatible standards that you've developed. And then indeed, I use standard there very loosely, because I see a lot that that in a specific field, a database that happens to have some kind of power just declares the standard. So they don't actually consult with their user base or potential user base. That's just how they designed it. Where it is the way it's published. And then it becomes what they call a de facto standard. And maybe it is a de facto standard, and it will grow and people will adopt it, but then it's probably just because there is no other choice for the users than to use it, rather than to discuss like we are used to in RDA, to get to actually a carried standard by a large group of potential users.
Phil, you have an interesting question. Did you want to unmute?
Sorry, yes. So which question were you referring to?
Do standards require governance?
Oh, do standards require governance? Yes, this concept of the de facto standard. I wonder if there is a risk of conflating a more colloquial definition of the term standard with some kind of formal definition of the term standard. Now, to me, coming into this conversation, I was just sort of interrogating what my internal definition of the word standard is. And for me, it seems that you need some kind of kite mark or something from some kind of standards organization, that there's a governance structure around it. And I wonder if that, sort of rings a bell with folks, or whether that, or whether that seems the wrong definition for this context.
I see 3 hands up. Are they new hands? So I see Jane, Wolmar, and Brian.
I'll jump in first.
Okay.
No, I agree with the comments really being made, and I really like what Brian was saying, and I like I'm losing track. Was it Rob who just? Oh no, Phil. What you just raised, Phil, and I think that you're both. I mean, it agrees with my thinking, but if I'm put in front of a bunch of material scientists and saying, okay, we need to come up with something, I'm going to use the word standard at first, because that's going to, get the message across to them before I say, oh, now we need to build a schema to support, like I like what Brian was saying, like you can have a standard schema. But yeah, I don't have an answer, but, I guess I'll mute again.
Okay.
And Walmart's going to help again.
Okay, Wolmar?
I mean, I feel I have derailed the discussion a bit, and this is the most common thing that ever comes up. What terms should we use? So I mean, it's mostly like maybe not use the term standard that much when we're talking about specific schemas, because I mean, you don't really know exactly what is implied by it, so to speak, and be more precise instead. Like this is a de facto standard, or it is well adopted, or it is adopted by these or supported by these organizations. So I just don't like the word standard replacing the word schema. So I mean, you could use them together, standard schema or something like that, if you really mean that this has some sort of stronger emphasis than just saying schema. Otherwise, it might be better to maybe say that these are kind of the 100 most commonly used schema in this field, or this is the schema that is supported by these official organizations, or something like that, because then people will understand what you mean, and they will also understand like why you have made the distinction to use the word standard there.
Okay, Brian.
And I'll agree with all of that, because a standard as a technical specification can be a standard schema, a standard terminology, a standard for the process, standard for the exchange, order of interactions that makes it happen. And all of these things can have a standard with, universal agreement to, this is the way we're going to have this exchange. So if you use the word standard to really mean one of those components, because of it's just common speak, that's what can lead to that type of confusion. But often people do that because the full name of the official standard for something it may just be easier to just call it by a shorthand name. I quickly want to introduce some of my background getting into this, because it's tying it back with an appreciation and further advancement on this crosswalk work. My background is primarily in the healthcare space, specifically evaluating clinical research results and converting that to clinical decision support. So to understand the science and apply that for real world healthcare decision support. In doing that, I came to appreciate a standard, a technical standard called Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, or FHIR, F-H-I-R, which has become substantial internationally for making electronic health record data interoperable. And that is great, but the world of science communication in understanding the evidence and supporting this, also many wanted this interoperability. And I've been leading efforts to extend FHIR to the communication of scientific evidence. We've developed a lot in that way, which is not unique to the healthcare space. Communicating evidence is communicating, science. But in developing those efforts, we have worked with other consortium mobilizing computable biomedical knowledge and FAIR for Health and various groups. And we've actually been working on a common pattern you can think of like a crosswalk. We've been calling it a common metadata framework to work across other schemes, and how do you share the metadata to try to facilitate across this. So we've been working on this for a while and just learned about the crosswalk that you've put together a couple weeks ago. But I shared in the chat, and I shared in a little more detail with links in the same link that you have for the sign up sheet. So freely sharing, here's what we've done, and it includes, we've gone to this crosswalk document and added a column T, and went through about 34 rows so far to say, how does this map to the metadata framework that we have? So if that helps in any way, or you'd like to collaborate further in either direction for facilitating this mapping, one of our big goals is to help make science computable. And of course, in Research Data Alliance, you're looking at science in much broader domains than just the healthcare domain, where we started from.
Thank you. Actually, Donnie, I think you're asking a really good question. Can we tie the discussion about schema and standards back to interoperability? Does anybody want to try that?
I'll give a quick answer. If you agree to speak with the same schema, right, you get interoperability. If you don't, and the standard is the agreement to have the same schema in that case for exchange.
Okay, some more hands. I'll start with Donnie, then Phil, then Wolmar.
Sure. As a response to what Brian just said, and harkening back to early in Jane's talk, just about interoperability, I guess there are different kinds, but I think one nice subset of interoperability is what's been termed adversarial interoperability, sort of interoperation as distinct from cooperation, where you don't really have someone's permission or really agree to interoperate, but you sort of can, and so I can imagine a standard being such that you can create a new schema and interoperate just because that's kind of the way that the standard allows, and it isn't tied to an individual schema. I'm not sure I can elaborate more abstractly than that. I don't know myself, but I sort of like that distinction that was brought up earlier of sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, cooperative interoperability versus adversarial. I don't need your permission. It's just sort of in the base of how it's specified that I can plug into what you're doing. And I think that's an interesting thing to bring up.
Okay, Phil.
Yeah, so this question of how you tie it back in, right? How do you tie in standards into interoperability? And one thing that occurs to me, so just to put this out there, is I think the intersection is around open standards. because if you want to be able to create a landscape where it's possible for small players, large players, community initiatives to all interoperate on a level playing field and to create perhaps competing services and community-owned services, then having those standards both open and well governed, I think is a key to that. So I think that sort of openness and that governance is how you enable or prevent things like vendor lock-in, right, and enable a fair landscape so that all systems can be fairly interoperable, if that makes any sense. It's just a thought.
Okay, Walmart.
I mean, interoperability is a case where standardization is a required step, so to speak. You need some sort of common understanding and definition to kind of map from, at least. So the different applications needs to be able to understand the common format, so to speak. And then you need to be very generic, which means that it cannot really be, or at least to my best understanding, it cannot be a full implementation of really anything, and maybe only define the structure of things, something like the RDF format, or we have DDI, CDI, which is up and coming for defining the structure of data sets of different types, but not the scales or the actual, like what types of values are allowed in them. So then you can map them to different standards based on that. A machine can understand the structure, and based on that do a mapping to another structure and the schema that is associated with it. So maybe setting up an ecosystem with some sort of star-like crosswalk structure where you have a very generic center point and finding ways to kind of take things into the generic, but then being able to take the generic and map it to more specific definitions from that. So not somewhere you need to kind of go from the specifics to something more simple, and then maybe extract the parts that make sense for a specific application. And the standardization part needs to be this kind of common understanding, the minimum common denominator, so to speak.
Thank you. So it's like interoperability is after the fact. Nobody starts out and says, I want to be interoperable with everything. I think it happens when, I think we went back in the chat farther about, there's a scientific question that requires interoperability. Does anyone ever start elsewhere and say, I want to be interoperable? Keith, did you want to talk about the EPOS at all?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I think, many cases where systems have been built designed for interoperation, especially if we're dealing with a lot of heterogeneous materials. So the EPOS case that's being mentioned, EPOS is not electronic point of sale, it's European Plate Observing System, and it's geoscience in Europe. And we have about 250 different asset suppliers. Between them, they have 17 different metadata formats and indeed some variants upon those. And we managed to integrate it all by using a superset metadata standard in our catalog. So it's designed for interoperability from the beginning. And indeed, we are managing to deal with adjusting as the metadata standards used parochially in the different communities, like the earthquake people, the tsunami people, the volcano people, and so on, as they evolve and change. So, I mean, the key point about interoperability is it's a never-ending story, because things evolve and change, either because of changing external standards and the need for compliance, or changing requirements from the communities. So here's one example.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. And as we've discovered, this is a very open question that probably fact, I know it can't be resolved with just one session, but I think this has been a really interesting discussion. I will get the slides posted in the notes, and I'll also put the chat in the notes because there's some really interesting comments in there. In fact, Reiner, you want to go ahead?
I really like this interoperability question because we use this word very, very often. And also, I like what Walmart was saying, that it's a kind of a common understanding. But I think the last comment is about, and also going into Keith, building a system or building something which is interoperable with something specific. That's feasible for me. To be interoperable with everything, no, I don't dare to think about it. I don't even manage it with the language.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining the session. And I will send out the link. The notes link will have all the information from this particular session, including the slides. And I'll let you know when the recording. Yeah, just a second. And I'll let you know when the recording will be available. It will be available in Whova right away for people who've paid for the plenary. Then later on, it'll be in YouTube. And Jane, go ahead.
Just thank you for a great session. But back to the thing. I think that there's this important question of, people working on interoperability just for the sake of interoperability and not thinking about the scientific question or why we're doing it. And back to my raising of questions. And so I just really appreciate this discussion and the questions, and just thank you.
And thank you for the questions, Jane. And all of our other speakers, thank you very much.
Rebecca, are you recording the chat, or is someone recording the chat?
I am, yes.
Yeah, good, thanks. I think there's some valuable stuff in there.
Very valuable.
Let me, as one of the other co-chairs of the group, thank everyone for a very, very good session. And Alex?
Yes, thank you all for coming and for this, wonderfully stimulating philosophizing that we've been doing. It's been great.
And back to our coordinator of this session, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you all. Bye.